Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait a few minutes to get started, but if you are curious and open to it, you can share in the chat where you're calling in from. I think we have a pretty global crowd today, so it'll be interesting to see. We have Rob Waller. See one person from Poland, but it does look like most people are here from the US. Oh, Canada and Italy. Germany, France, Portugal, Scotland. All right, I was right. We do have a good global crowd. This is awesome. All right, well, we can get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Just a few little housekeeping things. You see that we have a chat, which is great for chatting. But if you have a specific question for Maddie, it's best if you we can keep track of those better if you put them into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will answer those questions at the end. My name is Melissa King. I am a preventive conservator. I'm also the VP of Customer Experience at Conserve. And my colleague Carly is not visible, but she will be available to answer questions in the chat if you have any, and we'll help to also supply the questions at the end with the Q&A. And I am really pleased to introduce my friend, Maddie, who is a preventive conservator. I'm going to actually read her bio. So Maddie Cooper, she, her, is the owner of Principal Preventive is the owner and principal preventive conservator at MC Conservation Services. She has extensive experience in surveys, assessments, and teaching. She was the associate preventive conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts from 2021 to 2025, where she completed assessments, developed and taught workshops, and project managed initiatives like the preservation services in Puerto. Maddie has over 10 years of professional collections care experience. She held roles in conservation and collections at the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens and the Wolfsonian FIU prior to specializing in preventive conservation in graduate school. Through her graduate career, she worked with the Disaster Research Center, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the Midwest Art Conservation Center. Maddie holds an MS in Art Conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation, a BA in Chemistry from the University of Delaware, and a BA in Art Conservation with a minor in Art History from the University of Delaware. So we're really excited to have Maddie. She has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to emergency preparedness and response. And she is, I mean, I won't speak for her. She can speak for herself, but I'm really excited for you to hear her share her knowledge in this area when it comes to flooding.
Thanks, Melissa, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to see representation from all over the US and all over the world. That's really exciting. Like Melissa mentioned, my name is Maddie Cooper. I'm a preventive conservator, and I have a kind of a long-standing focus on emergency management and risk assessment for collections that really stems from my experience responding to damage to museum collections caused by Hurricane Irma in 2017, when I was a pre-program collections assistant in Miami. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see presentation slides. It looks like you can. So when Conserve approached me about presenting on the topic of flooding specifically, it felt pretty urgent given the terrible flooding that occurred in Texas in July, the flooding caused by Hurricane Helene in 2024, even some of the really intense flooding that's occurred in Europe within the past couple of years, and just the increased frequency and intensity that we've seen in these flooding events in the last decade have been really concerning for all of us, including in cultural heritage. So I want to emphasize that in flooding events, as with all emergencies, collections are not the priority. Human health and safety and the safety of personal homes and belongings always come first. That said, collections are also affected by these events, and there are ways that we can plan for and mitigate and respond to flooding and water emergencies that help protect collections and also kind of allow ourselves and our staff to focus on what's really important in their own lives when we're talking about bigger flooding events. So, why plan for flooding and water events specifically? Even if your institution hasn't been affected in the past, why is it important to think about flooding? First, because water is such a common source of damage for cultural heritage collections. The Heritage Health Information Survey, which was a 2014 survey, found that water was the most commonly cited source of damage to collections. 56% of respondents in that survey said that water caused more damage to their collections than any other risk. And granted, that's an old survey, was done in 2014. It's over 10 years old now, but we do know that intense storms and rain events have only increased since 2014 and that they'll continue to increase as a result of climate change. So even areas that aren't used to dealing with flooding, even buildings that have never had issues with leaking before, we're starting to see them experience flooding and water emergencies because they weren't necessarily built to withstand what we're dealing with now, which is part of why terminology is so important, but can also be really confusing when we're talking about flooding hazards. What does it mean to be in a 100-year flood zone or a 500-year flood zone? What does that actually mean for what you need to do to protect your collections? If your institution isn't in a flood zone, does that mean you're in the clear? That's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So with that in mind, I just want to give you a little roadmap for the rest of the presentation. We'll do a brief overview of the risk of water to collections and what kind of water emergencies we're talking about here. And then I'll introduce some hazard mapping tools that can help you better understand the risk of flooding to your particular location, your particular institution. We'll talk about identifying internal vulnerabilities so that those things about your building and your collection that could make them more vulnerable to damage caused by those external hazards. And then we'll close out by just touching briefly on emergency preparedness. But the focus today is really going to be introducing you to those tools that can help you understand the external flooding hazards and water hazards to your collection. And I'll say that I think I can say this that everyone who registered will make sure that you get a PDF copy of the slides. And I also put together a resource guide that has links to all of the different tools that I'm going to talk about today. So you don't have to worry about copying down hyperlinks and things like that. So just to start, there are four main types of physical deterioration that our collections experience, and water can lead to most of them. Water can cause mechanical damage by causing objects to swell and shrink. It can exacerbate chemical deterioration, and it can lead to big issues with biological deterioration like mold outbreaks, insect infestation. I had a mentor once who was a historic preservationist tell me that most preservation problems can be traced back to water and whether that's directly or indirectly traced to water. And I think that's mostly true. I think water and policy are the two biggest causes of damage to our collection. But if you're looking for more information on how water causes damage to collections, I think probably this is something you're all familiar with. But if you're looking for more information, there is a chapter about water in Conserve's Definitive Guide to Environmental Monitoring, which I wrote, which is a good overview of why we are so concerned with water and collections. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about water emergencies? What does that entail? They can be a number of things, probably more than you would expect. I like to group them into kind of three main categories. There are those natural and man-made disasters, things like hurricanes, storms, coastal and riverine flooding, even vandalism, those can be those natural and man-made disasters. Mechanical failures, this is what you're going to see most often, honestly. That's things like gutter failure, HVAC issues, plumbing issues. We're always thinking about, that major flood or that major hurricane, but a lot of the emergency response that I do and consult on has to do with issues with mechanical systems or the building envelope, sort of smaller things. So keeping that in mind. And then incidents, things like spills, equipment misuse, those can be water emergencies as well. So when we're talking about assessing the risk of water emergencies, we're talking about kind of two types of hazards that we're looking for. Those internal things, those things that have to do with your own building, your own site, your own mechanical systems, your own policies, and then external. What are the risks to your region? What are the natural hazards to your region? So it depends on your location, sure, but it also depends on your facilities and your infrastructure and how those work together to mitigate external hazards. So, just to talk briefly about internal hazards, when you're looking at internal hazards, it can be really helpful to think broadly. We're thinking about the obvious things like, is the roof in good condition? Are the gutters clean? But we also want to think about things like regular maintenance. Like, is someone coming out to service the HVAC system regularly? Are we changing out filters? Are we checking condensation traps? Even do we have a policy in place to handle an incident that happens during an event rental, for example? So even policy has to do with those internal hazards that your collections are exposed to. Risk assessment's really about taking a 30,000-foot look at your institution and your collection. And so you want to consider policies and procedures, facilities information, storage and display practices, and event history. What has happened before? I really like using checklists to assess internal hazards because they can be so broad. It's helpful to have a list of things to keep an eye out for. Some areas that I'm always considering when I'm doing an assessment are site drainage, the condition and performance of the roof and gutters, windows and skylights, condition and maintenance, the existence of plumbing and storage and display areas. Whenever I'm doing assessments, I'm always looking up because that's usually where most of the plumbing and stuff is. So I look for water lines, fire suppression, condensation traps. This image shows a sprinkler head that's right up against some duct work. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for when I'm looking for internal risks and doing assessments. And that's the kind of thing that you can look for if you're doing your own kind of internal assessment. I also want to consider whether or not an institution has any monitoring, any leak detection. Melissa's going to talk a little bit about leak detection at the end of the presentation. And I'm also considering storage. So is everything on shelves up off of the floor? What's the storage conditions that we're talking about and the display conditions that we're talking about? And I don't want to spend too much time talking about internal hazards because there are just a lot of resources out there that cover this topic. And the focus of this webinar is more on identifying those external hazards, but just to give you an idea of what you should be looking out for when you're assessing risk to your institution or what your risk assessor should be looking out for if you are working with an outside assessor. And these are just some of those risk assessment tools that have great resources for addressing internal hazards. The Risk Evaluation and Planning Program, or the REP program, is a free tool that's available on the website of the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation. And the REP program is basically a series of tools that includes a walkthrough checklist and an Excel spreadsheet that helps you evaluate and prioritize risks, as well as steps for developing an emergency plan. The National Park Service similarly has an Excel workbook template that helps you evaluate and prioritize collection risks. The Guide to Risk Management of Cultural Heritage from ECROM and the Canadian Conservation Institute is the cover of it is here, and the cover is so scary, but I always like to tell people that this is actually a really friendly resource if you're just getting introduced to risk assessment. There's a lot of worksheets. It really holds your hand and kind of walks you through the process. And you know, assessing internal hazards is pretty well trodden territory. There are a lot of things, a lot of resources for you. So I want to kind of move on from that and start talking about how to identify those external hazards and the tools that have been developed within the last 5, 10 years that we can utilize in cultural heritage in order to have a better understanding of what our flood risk is. So just before we dive in, I want to note that a lot of these resources are focused on the United States, and I know that we do have some international attendees here. So I want to talk about some global resources a little bit, but I also want to say that a lot of the concepts that I'm talking about here are transferable no matter what part of the world your collection is located in. So things like terminology, talking about 100 or 500-year flood zones and kind of understanding the different types of flooding and how to understand what the benefits and limitations of a hazard map are. That's going to be transferable whether you're looking at US-based resources or European resources. So in the United States, the way to assess flood risk has traditionally been the FEMA flood maps. They're maintained to help mortgage lenders determine insurance requirements for properties and to aid in community planning. So simply, these maps show how likely it is for an area to flood. And these maps are organized into zones, which are described in this table. And I guess I'll mention, since we were talking about those international tools, if any of our international listeners have tools like this that they like to use, if you could drop them in the chat, I think it'd be awesome to hear about that. But so to talk about these different zones, A zones and V zones have a 1 in floor chance of flooding during a 30-year mortgage. They can also be described as having a 1% annual chance of flooding or as being in a 100-year flood zone. B and X zones that are shaded represent moderate flooding risk. These have a between 1% and 0.2% annual chance of flooding, and they're often described as falling within the 500-year flood zone. And then C and X zones that are shaded represent minimal flood hazard, meaning they fall outside that 500-year flood zone, and there's a less than 0.2% chance of annual flooding. And then finally, there's D zones, which have undetermined risk. The image here shows the National Mall. Everything shaded in this blue-green color is in zone A, which is considered high risk. Those areas are within that 100-year flood zone. Areas shaded in orange are considered zone X, which means that they fall into that 500-year flood category. And areas shaded with orange and gray are also zone X. The stripes just designate that they have a little bit of a reduced flood risk due to a levee, but they still fall within that 500-year category. And then non-shaded areas have a minimal flood hazard, which means they fall outside of that 500-year category. Now, these maps can be helpful. I think they are a good place to start, but there are major issues with relying completely on maps like this to evaluate your flood risk. Over 40% of the claims to the National Flood Insurance Program from 2017 to 2019 came from properties that fell outside of the moderate to high risk zones on FEMA maps. So that means that these maps, as they are now, aren't really capturing flood risk very accurately. It's worth saying that they are based on historical data on flooding incidents in the past, which doesn't incorporate climate change or land development, which can majorly affect the way that an area is able to withstand flooding. And the designations of a 100 and a 500-year flood zone can also give us really a false sense of security, I think. They are based on historical data. But also, just because there was a 100-year flood last year doesn't mean that there will not be another 100-year flood this year. All it means is that based on historical data, there is, a 1% chance of annual flooding or greater. They kind of put flood risk into these categories of 100-year and 500-year. But in reality, it might be more accurate to say that an area in zone B has more of a 200-year or 300-year flood risk, but that's not really captured by these big bins that we're using for these FEMA flood maps. I do think that despite their flaws, looking at these maps are a good place to start when determining flood risk for your institution. They are relatively simple. And if your institution is located in one of these flood zones, you can be pretty sure that there is a flood risk. However, if your institution doesn't fall within a flood zone, it doesn't mean that you're out of the woods when it comes to flooding. It's a bit of a every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square situation. So if these maps aren't giving us the full picture, let's talk about what other resources are out there and can be helpful. There are several tools that are available to you. And when I talk about there being a lot of tools, there's a lot of tools that are available for, they're marketed specifically towards businesses and homeowners. So things like Climate Check and, other startup companies are looking at risk like this. But the one I want to highlight is designed specifically for the use by collecting institutions. It's the Hazard Risk Assessment Map from FAIC. It's part of their climate resilience resources, which are designed to walk users through building a full climate resilience plan for their institution. So this is just a part of that. This map is a tool that lives within this big suite of other tools, but I think it's a good roundup of a couple of different resources all in one place. It's a good like one-stop shop. So using this map, you can enter an address and then activate different layers that give you insight into the risk of different hazards, including different types of flooding. So the first layer that's available to you is current weather. It draws from several sources of real-time weather and alert data, and it's updated about every 15 minutes. The blue you see here shows forecasted precipitation on the mall within the next 72 hours. I think I took this screenshot maybe 3, 4 days ago. So it's obviously going to be different now, but this layer also has information about hurricane and tropical storm forecasting as well as wildfire data. So it's helpful for monitoring real-time events, for monitoring wildfire spread, for monitoring, for tracking storms, for tracking hurricanes. This kind of real-time data is helpful in the lead up to an event that you have warning for. Next up is the FEMA National Risk Index, which is a tool that assesses the risk of 18 natural hazards to every census tract in the United States. The National Risk Index gives regions risk scores based on the historic frequency of the hazard event, as well as social factors like infrastructure and community resilience. They provide scores for coastal flooding, which is flooding from oceans and bays. And there's also riverine flooding, which is flooding from rivers and streams. This type of flooding, riverine flooding, is sometimes referred to as fluvial flooding, fluvial with an F. And you can see here that the National Mall is located in an area that's considered very high risk for riverine flooding and relatively moderate risk for coastal flooding. But what this tool doesn't capture is the risk of pluvial flooding, pluvial with a P, which occurs when heavy precipitation overwhelms drainage systems and overwhelms the ground's ability to absorb water. And pluvial flooding is critical because it is exacerbated by development, by aging infrastructure, and by the increase in frequency and intensity of storms that we're seeing now. And that's one major risk that isn't captured by this tool. So that's why this resource and that's why I recommend looking at multiple different resources to kind of gain a fuller picture of the hazards facing your institution. And that's why this tool can include several resources as well. They're all giving you different information, but it's important to know the limitations of each of these tools. Another thing to keep in mind, again, these FEMA tools are using historical data to come up with these scores. So areas that have had low instance of flooding in the past, that may be at higher risk of flooding because of development or climate change may not be accurately rated using this tool. The next layer is from Climate Check. If you think about the current weather and the FEMA layers, they're open source data. They come from federal agencies, but Climate Check is a private company. It's a startup that gives risk ratings from 1 to 100 to each census tract in the US relative to the rest of the contiguous United States. And Climate Check data is good because it includes information on pluvial flooding. I know the fluvial is really confusing. I don't know who came up with that, but pluvial is the one that I'm really focusing on here because remember, that's the one that occurs when drainage isn't sufficient to meet the needs of an extreme precipitation event. So it includes information on pluvial flooding, which remember the FEMA data does not. And it includes modeled future data that incorporates different climate change projections. So the precipitation map that we're looking at here on this slide shows us the climate check rating for precipitation on the National Mall from now until 2050. And so obviously precipitation and heat are going to be those kind of extreme hazards that we're going to be thinking about if we're talking about assessing the risk to an institution on the mall. And then the final layers that you can look at using this tool are the layers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They show predictive data for different indicators of hazards based on climate change projections. So in this particular example, we're seeing that with a high emissions scenario, if we don't pretty drastically curb the amount of emissions that we're producing currently, precipitation days in this area that are above the 99th percentile, so heavy precipitation days, will increase from about 4.5 to 6 days per year by 2100, which is really high compared to the rest of the US. So if I'm looking at this, I know that Washington, D.C. is going to be dealing with increased high intensity rain days in the future, which is meaningful to me if my institution is located in an area with high pluvial flooding risk. So that's just an example of how you can kind of use these different tools to give you a little bit of different information to think about what you actually need to focus on when you're planning for the future. Now, there are other resources out there that can give you similar information to what is captured in FAIC Climate Risk Assessment Map. But I think for beginners, this is a really good place to start. And in addition to the map, there are lots of resources on how to use this tool and how to turn your findings into planning and mitigation strategies. I think it's important to, while recommending this tool, also just try and emphasize the importance of contextualizing this information. So, for example, a lot of these maps show you information based on census tract. So FEMA is showing you information based on census tract. And FEMA is saying in the census tract, relatively, riverine flooding is very high. Now, is riverine flooding going to be the same risk all the way over here on the east side of the census tract as it is back over here towards the tidal basin? I don't know. It's capturing that information for a big area. So understanding that, understanding what level of information you're getting from these tools is really important. Climate Check is also working by census tract. So the information you're seeing isn't for a specific point on a map, it's for a specific census tract. So the area that your institution is located in has this risk relative to the rest of the country, but that risk may be greater or lesser depending on exactly where your institution is and the elevation that your institution is located at. These NOAA projections, I believe, are not based on census tracts. They are based on exact location. So they can give you a little bit more precise information about different hazards. So just to say, when you're using these tools, understanding the scale, understanding where that information is coming from. Is it coming from historical data or is it coming from modeled future data? And understanding what the maps are showing you and what they aren't showing you is important to keep in mind. Now, in addition to those mapping tools, another resource that can be beneficial to consult, and I really recommend everyone um, look for these because I think they can be such an incredible tool, are state and local hazard mitigation plans. These are risk assessments and emergency plans that are put together at the state and local level, and they often have more detailed information than you're going to find in these national tools. So often they have exhaustive lists of historic events, history of property damage caused by different hazards, information about what the city and state are doing to mitigate that risk, and also maps and tools. So this is a map from Philadelphia. I am currently living in Philadelphia. This is a map from Philadelphia's hazard mitigation plan. It shows, not only the FEMA floodplains, but also areas that experience flooding caused by sewer backups and surface flooding. So that's that pluvial flooding we were talking about. So by looking at this map, I know that if my institution is located, in Port Richmond, maybe I'm not in a FEMA flood hazard area, but I am in an area that's at high risk of pluvial flooding. So that is something I need to keep in mind. So these state and local plans, they differ depending on where you are in terms of how exhaustive the risk assessments are and how much detail is available to you. But I think it's really helpful to at least look out for a plan that touches on your area because it's really allowing, state and local experts to kind of do this work of hazard identification for you. And they also have information about human caused hazards, including things like infrastructure failure. So the Philadelphia plan, for example, has an assessment of the risk of dam failure, which isn't going to be captured in any of the national tools that I talked about earlier. And this is a level of detail that you don't get with those national tools that are focused on natural hazards. So that was a lot of information about external hazards that I just threw out. So just to review kind of briefly, there are a lot of tools that we can look at to identify external risk to our sites and to our collections. But to avoid getting overwhelmed, I recommend using the hazard risk assessment tools, which allow you to look at several different map layers in one place. You can use the current weather map to track ongoing weather events. The FEMA National Risk Index layer is good for looking at hazards that have historically been an issue for your area. Climate check is great to look at if you are worried about pluvial flooding. And the NOAA layers are really good to consult when thinking about how climate change will affect the hazards that your site experiences long term. So those NOAA excuse me, NOAA levels are looking at 50-year, 100-year, 150-year projections. So when you're thinking really long term, it can be helpful to look at those. And I also really recommend looking at state and local hazard mitigation plans, which can help you identify more site-specific information and information on human-caused emergencies, including infrastructure failure. So that's a great place to start with identifying external hazards. I do want to touch briefly on preparing for water emergencies. Again, this is pretty well trodden territory in terms of resources that are available to you. And, I've included several resources about emergency planning and preparedness in the document, but just to mention, really everything that you can do ahead of time is going to be the best mitigation when it comes to mitigating water risk. So this, of course, includes emergency planning. Obviously, I'm a preventive conservator. I want everyone to have a beautiful, comprehensive emergency plan. But even if you don't have a big, fancy, comprehensive plan, I absolutely want everyone to have at least an abbreviated plan. So, this image shows the pocket response plan from the Council of State Archivists. That's linked in the resources. It's a great place to start. At the very least, you want to have a strong sense of how you're going to keep people safe in the event of a water emergency. You want to have accurate contact information for everyone on your staff and any vendors or contractors that you might work with. You want to have information and you want to have a sense of how you will document damage if there is any. That's going to be really important for your recovery efforts, whether that be making an insurance claim or making a case for receiving aid in the event of damage caused by an emergency. Um, and then also understanding where all the utilities are. It can be really helpful to call those out on a map. But that's kind of like the bare minimum if you're going to have anything in terms of an emergency plan, if you're going to put your effort into, if you're going to spend a day, an afternoon working on an emergency plan, I recommend focusing on these couple of things. And then there are the things that you can do that are just part of good collections care practice that are going to mitigate the risk of water damage. So anything that you're doing before hurricane season, before rainy season, just throughout the year, just as part of your normal collections care. So keeping collections up off of the ground, basic monitoring, looking for those stained ceiling tiles, drawing a Sharpie marker around them to see if they're growing or changing, noticing when leaves get through the exterior doors in the fall, using those clues to help you understand what the state of your building envelope is, maintaining landscaping. Are you keeping trees trimmed? Is there a lot of overhang? Is the landscaping conducive to drainage? Are you maintaining drainage on site? Um, and then leak detection is another really amazing tool, especially if you've identified internal hazards that make the risks of leaks or water issues. Uh, Leak detection can be really helpful. So, with that in mind, I'm just going to turn it over to Melissa, who's going to talk a little bit more about leak detection. And I think she has a case study to talk about as well.
Thank you, Maddie. Yeah, so Maddie mentioned leak detection. It can be a really powerful tool for us when it can help us identify a potential hazard before it gets to be a bigger problem. I think when we think about leak detection, we're probably largely thinking about some of these internal leak risks that Maddie was talking about early on. But I do think there's a place for flooding as well. Particularly if you can't access the building, it would be nice to know if there are areas that are flooding, which is why it would be valuable to have remote automated leak detection, which is what we have at Conserve. So we have three different types of options when it comes to leak detection. They all report wirelessly and automatically through our gateways that connect to the internet via cell service or an Ethernet connection if that's what you have. And you would have access to set up alerts through email or via text message, as you can see on this screen here. The three types of leak detection that we have are in the middle is a point leak detection. So those two little metal prongs, if they both get wet at the same time, that will let you know if that area is wet. It's for a very specific location. And there are instances where you might want to monitor if there's like a pan where you have a leak coming from the ceiling that consistently fills up. You might want to know and you might place the point leak detection in that area. Or if you just happen to know where a recurring leak happens, that can be really useful for that. The one on the bottom is rope leak detection, the yellow one. So that yellow circle on the top unravels and you can place it to get a little bit more surface area than just those two prongs in the middle one. So that's if you have like a general idea of a region where you might get water. I currently have it set up in my basement in my home because I get to test these things. But it is useful because I do have a flooding basement. But I know that there's a whole region of the space where I want to monitor for water intrusion. And then the third one is our newer leak detection sensor. I have it here physically. It's tape leak detection, which is pretty nifty. This actually, this is a piece of tape. The whole thing will, you can place the sticky part of the tape on a certain area. So if there is, the curve of the corner of your room, or if you want to place it above ceiling tiles, I think you can be pretty creative here. I'm actually pretty excited to start getting more case studies for how people are implementing these things if they're wrapped around pipes, that sort of thing. And we are getting a sense that facilities managers are pretty excited about this as a potential option for them. So all of these would, if water is detected, you would get a notification on your phone or in an email, depending on how you set up alerts. And it can happen remotely, as I mentioned, and will be pretty immediate so that you can respond in a way before things get too bad. So you can go to the next slide, Maddie. I also put, like, you'll see on both of these slides, there's a QR code to learn more about leak detection and talk to us if you're interested. I just wanted to share one case study. This is with June Ebersol. He's at the McWane Science Center in Birmingham, Alabama. It's an interesting use case. It's a science museum that also has a living collections as well, has an aquarium, and they've had issues in the past. They have 30 aquarium specimens tanks, and at one point, it says in 2015 they had to close the whole science center for 3 months due to massive flooding, which is not only potential damage for collections, but it's also potentially a huge loss of revenue for that museum, which puts them at risk in other ways as well. So he was really keen on getting leak detection set up, and he's reported that it's giving him a lot of peace of mind in identifying an emergency before it becomes too large. So yeah, and I'll hand it back over to Maddie. I know that you just wanted to summarize again what we went over in the presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Yeah. Um, okay, yeah. So just to return to this really, really briefly to wrap everything up, understanding water risks. So, almost every preservation issue can be traced back to water in some way. So if we're going to spend our time identifying and mitigating risk of something, water is definitely a good thing to think about. Assessing and using hazards, using different mapping tools. That's really what the presentation focus was. So just, trying to introduce you to a couple of these tools and some of the things that you'll be thinking about when you're using them, trying not to get tripped up by that terminology. 100-year, 500-year floodplains can be really confusing. And then identifying internal vulnerabilities, just this idea of, walking through with an eye to what could potentially go wrong when it comes to water? What are the different points of entry for water in my institution? What do I need to keep an eye on? And then finally, preparing for emergencies. Obviously, all that good collections care work is going to help you mitigate the risk of water damage to collections, but also preparing in terms of emergency preparedness is going to be really, really helpful as well. So, just to say, as we're wrapping up the presentation, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. Melissa mentioned earlier that I am the owner of MC Conservation Services. I'm a preventive conservator, and we offer assessments, including risk assessments and emergency planning consultation. We also do preservation needs assessments if you're going through the process of looking for accreditation, or you're interested in, pursuing some larger grant funded projects that can be really helpful. We also do gallery maintenance and preventive cleaning workshops and consulting. We have a couple resources on the website. I just put up one about how to choose a vacuum for collections care. So, yeah, if you'd like to learn more about MC Conservation Services. Check us out on the website. I'll also provide my email and phone number if you have any questions about anything that we talked about today. I'd be happy to chat with you about it, either by email or happy to hop on a call. I know some of this stuff can be confusing, so I'd be really happy to kind of walk you through it if you're new to external hazard assessment. And then with that, I would be happy to take any questions if we have any.
I see one question in the Q&A, so please enter other questions if you have them. I know I have some as well, but let's start with the one that we have from Dasha. They're wondering if the groundwater table is a different type of flooding, like for context, basements used for storage if they're below groundwater elevation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, so groundwater is not something that I touched on or that is touched on in the FAIC risk assessment tools, but there are maps out there that are specific to groundwater flood risk maps. So my recommendation, if that's something that you want to look into, is to, I think FEMA has a bunch of them for folks in the US, is to check out those FEMA groundwater risk assessment tools, but just keep in mind that when you're looking at those maps, just keep in mind everything we talked about today. So how are they assessing that risk? Is it by specific location or is it by census tract? And then also, how is that data? Where is that data coming from? Is it based on historical information, or is it based on projections that include things like climate change modeling?
Great. I have a question. So I was looking up my hazard mitigation plans for where I live in Portland, Maine, and I'm wondering if that's something that's available to me because I live in a city or like within a city. Is like if I were to live in a very rural area, would I expect to be able to find one of these hazard mitigation plans?
Um, it depends, unfortunately. So the way the hazard mitigation plans have historically worked is that in order to receive aid from FEMA, uh, states and at least at the state and county level have had to produce these hazard risk mitigation plans according to FEMA standards. So there should at least be one for your state and hopefully one at least for your county that's available. And then if you live in a city, you're more likely to have a city specific one. But even if you're looking at the state or county level, the benefit of using something like that is that there are people looking, specifically at risks for your areas. They're going to include things like, um, locations of first responders, locations of potential like hazardous materials sites. They're going to be looking at, there's one in Philadelphia that keeps me up at night, which is a map of structurally unstable bridges in the city of Philadelphia. So like I mean, I guess at least they're tracking all of them. I don't know if we're doing to mitigate that hazard, but it's going to give you a lot more specific information than you're going to get from these tools.
Um, so I have a question. I'm in the chat. They're all coming in the chat. So I appreciate if you guys put it into the Q&A, but I will read from the chat for now. I have one from Nikki asking if there is a way to overlap these maps to see where your institution is located.
Yeah, yeah. So using the FAIC risk assessment tools, you can overlap all of the different maps. That's definitely something you can do. It gets a little bit tricky because it's like information overload. The way that I work best is by looking at them one at a time, but sometimes it can be helpful to like, for example, if you are putting up your FEMA flood hazard maps to see what your annual percent chance of flooding is, and then you're putting up like the fluvial or pluvial flooding map to see if any of those areas overlap. There'll probably be of greater concern than just one or the other. Yes, so Jennifer, I want to point out that Jennifer in the chat. So I should say that in addition to these publicly available open source sources like FEMA and NOAA, there are also services like Climate Check and like First Street Foundation, with Jennifer Wellock put in the chat, which are companies that are doing these types of risk assessments. Most of them have a model where you can do some level of free risk assessment for your particular location. And so I think First Street Foundation, you can get a report. You type in an address and you can get that information in the form of a report. And Climate Check, I think, is similar to that. So there are um, there are a bunch of sorry, I need to stop looking at the chat because I keep getting distracted by awesome resources people are leaving. Um, but yeah, just to point out that there are a lot of different tools that you can use to do this kind of work. It's just, I'm more emphasizing the mindset that you want to have when you're using these tools of understanding where the data is coming from and what exactly it's showing you.
Okay, I'm going to go to the Q&A because I see one there, and then I'll jump back to the chat. So Blanca's wondering, what are your top three recommendations to start a flooding risk protocol or management for collection care? And hello from the Dominican Republic.
Oh, awesome. That's really exciting. Um, 3 steps recommendation to start a flood risk protocol or management for collections care. I think always with any kind of emergency management project or anything, I always emphasize that human health and safety is number one. It seems like silly and redundant to say, but I've just been involved in a couple responses where, because people want to jump in, they want to jump in and help and start, pulling stuff out of it's to start saving stuff. But the reality is that human health and safety comes first always. These are just objects at the end of the day. And so making sure that you have a plan for keeping people safe is always going to be number one. The number two most helpful thing I would say is making a plan for documentation. So, if there is a flooding event in which your institution is affected or any of your collections are affected, again, it can be really tempting to kind of jump in and start acting, but documenting exactly what happens, taking tons of photographs, taking notes, making diagrams of what was affected, where, how much was affected, is just really, it's an important step that I think a lot of us forget. And then maybe number three for starting a flooding risk protocol. Um, I think if you are an area that is prone to flooding and you know that flood is a major risk to your institution, having a plan in place for, if not drying out collection areas mechanically, at least having a plan for getting airflow around collections, because mold is always that kind of secondary emergency that happens after water events. So, really considering ways to mitigate the risk of mold would be a recommendation of mine.
Okay, I see more in the Q&A. So can you recommend any templates for documentation of damaged collections?
Yes, there's one that comes from this. I'm like sitting next to my bookcase of all my emergency resources. But there is a field guide assessment form. This is the field guide to emergency response. In this resource, there's a field guide assessment form that's not showing up because I have my background blurred on, but it's also available online. And that's another FAIC resource. And it's basically just a worksheet that you fill out when you are doing an assessment after an emergency. And I
Okay.
see a question here, how high off the ground do you always recommend for collection storage? So as a preventive conservator, it doesn't mean if I'm talking about emergencies or just collections care in general. My number one recommendation to any institution is to work on getting their collection objects up off of the ground. And the reason for this is because years and years ago, when I was an undergraduate student, I got to see a lecture by the preventive conservator Gaël de Gouchen, who lives in Italy. I think he's French, but he's like an amazing character. If you ever get a chance to meet him or hear him speak, I greatly recommend it. But he was telling us about these preventive conservation projects that he was working on all over the world. And he works on a lot of reorg projects, which is an ECROM thing. And his number one thing was to get objects up off the ground. And I sort of raised my hand and was like, what about IPM? And he was like, no, it doesn't matter. Just get things up off the ground. And I have found that to be true in my career. Just getting things 4 to 6 inches up off the ground protects them from standing water, from insect infestation, from getting kicked. And it's also really nice because even if you're a really small institution, you don't have a ton of resources. Um, I think it's achievable with like some 2x4s and some volunteers. So, yes.
Um, okay. So we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. There was one about how often you should be doing risk assessments, and now I'm trying to find it because it was in the chat. Um, yes, I'm pretty sure that's what I saw. Oh yeah, Rebecca asked, how often would you do risk assessments on your building yearly, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because ideally, in a perfect world, you would want to do one once a year, but it's one of those things where we're all wearing a million different hats and it can be really difficult. So I would say if you've got a good emergency plan in place that's based on a pretty comprehensive risk assessment, taking a look at it either every 3 years or every time there's a big storm or incident in your area. I think, if you're looking at those state local hazard mitigation plans, they usually update those every 2 to 5 years. So I think that's a good rule of thumb for us as well.
Okay. I think that was it. I'm gonna ask one more question. Let's say you're doing an assessment with somebody and you recommend leak detection or if if that's within their budget, like how would you go about identifying locations where to put that? That's probably a big question, but
Oh yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is exactly what we were talking about is doing that internal hazard assessment. You know, basements are like number one. But also, I work with a lot of institutions that have chronic issues with roof leaks or even HVAC issues. So if you know that there's an area in your collection storage or in your exhibition area where leaking has been an issue in the past, I would definitely recommend placing leak detection there. And yeah, I don't know. You work with folks that are doing this. So do you have any thoughts, Melissa?
I mean, largely we've been finding that when it comes to community, like usually we're communicating with people that work like specifically with the collections, but when it comes to leak detection, we've been finding that people that work in facilities are more interested in this because they
Mm-hmm.
know the building better. So, and oftentimes they have their own budget to handle these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things too. That's useful to know for people. So a lot of times, if you have somebody that manages the facilities more directly, they might have a good inclination of where the leak spots are and where they might
Yeah.
be worried about. But outside of what you shared, I think that covers it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then I might add areas that are difficult to access. So I think this has come up like 2 or 3 times in the past couple of years where I've been working with institutions that have compact shelving and had leaks that they couldn't see, because of the compact shelving that led to mold issues because there's just not enough air circulation within that compact shelving to allow for fast enough evaporation. So areas that are harder to get to might be really good for technology like that.
Great. Okay. Well, we have 1 minute left. There was one question just to ask if you could remind the name of the book that you held up. Um,
Oh yeah, it's the field guide to emergency response. I'll put it in the chat. AIC and FAIC just retooled their website, so I'm not sure. I don't want to send a link because I'm not sure if it's going to be right, but you can Google that. And I believe there's also an app that you can download now that has a lot of this information. Um, But yeah, the form I was talking about is what is it exactly called? I think it's called the field assessment form, but there's a lot of really good information in this resource.
Well, thank you so much. We're at time right now, but appreciate everyone for joining us. Hopefully this was helpful. I know I learned a lot. We really appreciate your time, Maddie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
All right, take care.